Good evening. Welcome to our time of Bible study tonight. I hope this message finds you well. We have so many things to be thankful for, and one of those things is that our only folks that we know of who have tested positive for the COVID virus are the Pettits, and they are recovering well now, and that is certainly an answer to prayer. So we continue to pray for them and for all of the people who are suffering through this time. But tonight we're going to study the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. This is out of Dr. Claypool's book, Stories Jesus Still Tells. And he just does a beautiful job with this, relating this to our present day. And I think this parable may be more important in the days in which we find ourselves now than they ever have been before. Hear this as if you're hearing it for the first time. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. Well, this probably outside of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus is holding up someone that they would have considered to be a horrible person, this is probably the next in line where people who heard it for the first time absolutely would have been beside themselves in what Jesus had to say. It would have been shocking that Jesus drew this conclusion for this conventional wisdom of the day being really turned on its head. He says all of those listening have been familiar with the Pharisees. They were the most devout people in their society. The word Pharisee means pure, so they were always seeking out purity. They were also seeking out nationalism. So they were all consumed with being right and with holding themselves up above others. In contrast, tax collectors were at the absolute opposite end of the spectrum. Remember that the Holy Land was occupied by the Roman occupation, and they were smart about how they collected their taxes. They didn't send soldiers from town to town to collect taxes. They would find people within the society who were willing to kind of be turncoats on their own people and allow them to skim off the top any extra that they got. So you can imagine people don't like paying taxes at all anyway, but they really would have looked down on their own people who would have done such a thing. It's hard for us to understand in our society why they would have been hated the way that they do. But we can't understand that we don't like paying taxes. Imagine that it's your neighbor coming to you and knowing that you're having to pay even more than is due because that's how they get paid. So for Jesus to use this as an example would have been really, jaw-dropping to the people who heard it for the first time. He says, Pharisees believed that they were morally superior to most other human beings. So here's the first element of surprise when he holds up this tax collector over against this Pharisee. The image of a repentant tax collector defied all stereotypes of the day. So obviously Jesus is getting their attention very quickly when he tells this. He says, however, imagine the earthquake of shock that must have followed Jesus' next statement. I tell you that this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. When Jesus said those words, I am confident a horrified gasp went up to all who heard it for the first time. He says, in effect, their conventional system of values was completely turned upside down. He says, I want to pause and acknowledge that the shock those folks experienced as they listened to Jesus grew out of genuine moral concern. Was Jesus actually suggesting that it really did not matter what people did with their lives, or that one sort of behavior was no different than another. Pharisee represented all the moral achievement. He says, let's face it, to order one's business affairs along the lines of justice and mercy and honesty, and one's personal interactions along the lines of non-exploitive chastity is no small accomplishment. In other words, you know, we tend to see, looking back, that Pharisees were all bad, and they weren't. These were a lot of very upstanding people, but if they actually were what they said that they were, then it was no small thing to get there. One German philosopher said, "You can tell a person who is serious about his or her religion when it affects two things: their stomach and their pocketbook." Meaning, did they actually fast twice a week? I mean, that's not an easy thing to do. It's very difficult for any of us to do that. And also, do they actually put their money where their mouth is? Well, I'll never forget the first time I heard it put in a way that really made me think. It was the first time I heard Dr. Bill Self, say, if you're going to call yourself a Christian, I want to see your calendar and your checkbook. And that immediately got too personal for me, but it really got me thinking. And the thinking is that if you're going to call yourself a Christian, then important aspects of your life should reflect that, where you spend your time and where you spend your money. So he makes a very valid point here that we're not to just gloss over the accomplishment that the Pharisees had here. He makes the point that money is an ally to our egotism. To take that pool of power and voluntarily relinquish control over part of it out of loyalty and to our affection for God is a significant religious act. He said, here's a person who is serious enough about God to let his devotion affect both his stomach and his pocketbook. For Jesus to suggest that this sort of person was religiously inferior to a man who had no spiritual track record at all, but in a moment of desperate crisis came begging for mercy, was understandably upsetting. There is no indication in the parable that the tax collector intended to change his behavior or promised any reparation at all. He simply cried out for mercy in a time of need, which is religion in its most primitive, self-centered kind. It is no wonder that Jesus' hearers were aghast at what he had to say. So he began to compare himself to the people along the Pharisees, beginning to compare himself to the people alongside him rather than to his relationship with God. The Pharisee grew proud of himself and the level to which he had risen, complacent about the distance he still had to grow toward the ultimate goal of maturity. He says, it was as if the Pharisee were a 10th grader comparing himself to a student in the 2nd grade. Jesus used this example to show that when our focus is deflected from God, our growth into spiritual maturity is dealt a lethal blow. The old question, compared to what, is really crucial at this point. He says, this is what Jesus was criticizing in the Pharisee, not what he had achieved, but how he had taken his eye off the goal. He was sounding as if he was content with where he was. But something had happened to the tax collector. He was in a very different position. He had achieved nothing really in the sphere of his moral development. He was in kindergarten, you might say, in terms of what God wanted him to be. But something had happened in his life to jog him awake. Here he was, honestly acknowledging his lack and crying out for grace to help him in times of trouble. We're not told what it was that made this happen in the tax collector's wife, but one of the ways that God's ingenious grace often works is to let us, in freedom, misuse our power and to make an absolute mess of our own and others' lives. I hope the way that you've heard me say it many times is that God will allow us to learn on our own what we refuse to be taught. And this can happen in small ways. It can also happen in tragic ways. I'll never forget hearing Dr. Claypool tell the story of he got a call one Saturday afternoon. This man's habit on Saturday was to sit around his house and have a few beers and watch baseball. He was a big baseball fan. And one day he had 3 beers and decided to run to the store. And he got out in his car and accidentally backed up over his own child. And now they call in, their pastor and Dr. Claypool goes to the hospital, and here he is sitting with this wife and husband dealing with this horrific situation. He wasn't completely drunk. He had just let things go a little bit too far and paid devastating consequences for it. So we have to ask ourselves, do we wait until it's tragic before we work on something, or are we constantly trying to do a little bit better in our relationship with God? He says, in all likelihood, the tax collector had a similar experience, some event that made him aware of how out of sync he was with his true self. And, one of the first things that happens when you go to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings is the very first step is that this is beyond your control. You are admitting that you are no longer in control, and you're going to have to reach out to something bigger, reach out to God to help you get through this. He says, God's everlasting mercy and unending patience, God's desire, no matter what, to bring us to full completion. When grace of this sort is given access to our lives, as seems to be the case with the tax collector, then the possibility for spiritual growth is enhanced. He says, can you imagine the Pharisee saying, there are steps where I yet must grow and need God to help me? So Jesus has really painted a picture of the different places where these people are. And if you think about it, in the Bible, what we see over and over again are broken people who are open to what God would have them to do, who are at least open to partnering with God to make something happen. That's the overall theme that we see over and over again in the Bible. He says it's not hard, however, to conceive of the tax collector leaving the temple in such a creative and hopeful frame of mind. He had broken through in his honesty to the one thing that is utterly essential to completion, the availability of the divine grace that enables the whole process. By looking forward to the goal of God's grace, not sideways at others with him, the tax collector, rather than the Pharisee, went to his home justified. Now remember, when we look at parables, they're not about the people who we are reading about. They're about us. And it's in effect, the reason that Jesus was so effective with his parables was that ultimately it holds up a mirror to us where we see ourselves. So the first thing to realize when we are looking at ourselves and trying to grow through this is that the issue here is attitude, not achievement. It's not where we are. It's not in terms of how much we have achieved. It's where we are in our own mind of whether or not we want to continue to grow. He says, given their present attitudes, the Pharisee had a past but no future, while the tax collector had the opposite. No past to brag about, but a genuine promise of a better future. With God, the future is always more important than the past. The Holy One is more interested in what we can become than what we can achieve. And this is something, anytime I say this from the pulpit, that God is always more interested in our future than our past, I always get these looks of recognition, because so often people come to church with some guilt on their part about their past. And when we honestly ask for forgiveness and honestly want to grow, I love to use the way the psalmist said that God takes our sins, throws them as far as the east is from the west, and remembers them no more. When we can start with that, that is really conducive to grow in our spiritual lives. Well, what is the criteria that we evaluate our lives compared to what? That's the basic question in an act of interpretation. Jesus is reminding us here that what other people are doing or failing to do is beside the point. The Pharisee is looking sideways. The tax collector was looking up at God, and that is the important perspective. So what happened to the Pharisee is a special temptation for those who have achieved a high level of moral development. We should never find ourselves complacent in our spiritual lives. It should always be reaching up to God and out to other people. He says, we shall become full grown by God's grace and God's grace alone. There is no other way. And he ends this by saying that the point here to make is not to judge others for where they are We're not to judge ourselves by where they find themselves, and we're not to judge them for where they find themselves either. He says, none of us ever knows enough about another to render an accurate verdict. He says, remember, we never know enough about other people to judge them. Since we did not create these folks, we are not ultimately responsible for them. That is God's job, not ours. So is our religion about being right, or is it about growing in God no matter where we find ourselves? Think about that for just a moment in the society in which we find ourselves today. People are so entrenched in wanting to be right. It's at the expense of the relationships with the people around them and at the expense of their relationship with God. Jesus is using this parable as a warning to us not to find ourselves in that situation, but to hopefully not find ourselves in a devastating situation before we finally want to grow from where we are to where God would have us. I hope this message has found you well tonight, and I pray for your well-being. Go in peace.